The year 2020 was a challenging and overwhelming one. We have every reason to ask, have we Christians been the salt and the light to the world, or if we have been a part of the problem? Over the past several months, a group of 10 international leaders have addressed this question in the series of face-to-face webinars organized by Leadership Focus International. They talked about democracy, truth-telling, social justice, integrity, critical thinking, populism, nationalism, politicized faith, conspiracies, elections, pandemics, and more. At the end of this year, and at the beginning of the new one, we would like to share a group of highlights that remain relevant at a time when we are facing a new year full of questions, uncertainties, challenges, and rapid changes. This compilation of highlights we have named Democracy in Distress, a Christian perspective on 2020 and beyond.
So as I look at social media myself and truth-telling, I'm fighting, or I am influencing continually those people, students, former colleagues, but also relatives. And when you start talking about truth-telling, and when your own relatives from around the world have very different viewpoints and opinions, gets even more complicated than when you're just trying to persuade people beyond that kind of narrow influence. Recently, there have been fights on social media among our own family members because of the perspectives and the truth as people see it, or lack of truth as they see it. So I'm saying social media becomes this platform that is many things. I want people to see that I'm baking sourdough starter bread, as well as advocating for social justice. And how do you do that one after another in the posts? It's a very confusing and very difficult thing at times, because it's not monolithic, it's not homogenic, it's a very, very complex polyphony of perspectives, voices, and issues that we are constantly expressing. So that's my struggle and my continual confusion on how to best do that. So that's personal disclaimer and personal history. But then we also need to have historical context of the issues that we are facing. National or world movements, signs of the new raises in fascism and extremism. And then we need to look back at the history, as I again, in my book, I addressed, and in consequent chapters and articles, issues of Nazism that is so close to many of us, because some of us, I'm of a German descent, and so the issues of Nazism have been present and studied in a kind of post-Holocaust ways, but I think that they need to be resurrected lest we forget, because it seems that some of these sentiments continue coming up not only in America, but in Europe in a very, very uncomfortable ways. And so knowing history, historical context, what we believed we were fighting against in the sense of a Christ-centered life should be re-examined, rethought, and a lot to learn, and some of the things to unlearn. So that's my first point, historical context. And then even going back beyond the history of recent times, look at the biblical history. In what sense have refugees, hatred for minorities, issues of the people who are marginalized been presented and represented through the prophetic voices in the Jewish scriptures, in the Old Testament, and in the prophetic voices of the New Testament of Jesus as someone who is the primary example for us to know how to go about living our kingdom of God sentiment today. So, even people in the ancient times, in biblical times, were reluctant to refugees. But now we look people like babies jailed, internment camps that are happening. And being informed is a very important aspect of telling the truth. So historical context. Secondly, and it was mentioned before, critical thinking. again, as an educator, I struggle when I see people with so little critical thinking posting or thinking in the way that their politics or the sources of what they are listening to is in some way informing them, and not exercising the critical thinking. People with masters, I have colleagues and friends who studied with me, who are posting things that are beyond belief. And sometimes I'm just perplexed. How can that happen? Where is their critical thinking in the process of what they see and what they post? And maybe I need to think also about myself. Am I exercising critical thinking? Am I doing Socratic, Platonic, the unexamined life is not worth having and not living? And therefore, am I continuing to examine and think critically? Because you see, as the matrix, for those of you who are, you mentioned so much postmodernism and postmodernism and postmodernism and post-secularism that has been very heavily in Europe, and in America we haven't yet smelled the coffee how much it's actually penetrating our culture, and it is hugely. But it's that film, The Matrix, in which again the Platonic ignorance is a bliss came so powerfully to us. You know, ignorance is a bliss, but actually I don't want to choose that pill. It seems that a lot of people are choosing that pill and thinking that that's harmless, but ignorance is actually taking lives. When people are out of ignorance speaking, and this has been just recently, again, in articles in New York Times and Washington Post and LA Times and others explored here. The Observer, The Independent have had articles on this, on how some of the media that is giving us those ignorant kind of aspects are really resulting in more people dying from, for example, COVID-19, because of the ignorance, and the ignorance that is perpetrated through news, through media channels. And the study, something that we should really look at very carefully at. So at what cost do we allow ignorance to be a bliss? And at what cost should we fight for the truth telling that will disperse ignorance and hopefully save lives of people who are just, living in that kind of context of ignorance?
We have a responsibility, I would say even an obligation, to uphold and seek truth in all things. And this was always the case, but especially now, in a time where misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories seem to be spreading like wildfire. And these elements are dangerous because with so many different and opposing narratives running around, it's becoming near impossible for people to filter out the truth from all the rest. And when we don't know what's true, we become extremely vulnerable to manipulation. And some argue that there is no truth. As you indicate with the title for this conversation, Tiomir, we live in a post-truth era. People might wonder why the loss of truth is considered dangerous, and many seem to think that this is simply being progressive and open-minded. In our culture, everything is relative, and to speak in absolutes means you must be either a fundamentalist or you're uneducated. And people will say, live your truth, speak your truth, but don't impose it on me. That's the mindset of our days. And this is a challenge for us as Christians. We cannot conform to this thinking because essentially we do believe in one single absolute truth, the truth of Jesus. And if we start watering this down to conform to a culture of relativism, we're in danger of watering down the very core of ourselves. Even if we take our faith out of the equation, embracing the lack of absolute truth creates a dangerous precedent in our society. If there's no truth, there's no credibility. And when there's no credibility, there's no trust. And the lack of trust will erode our conversations, our relationships, our democracies, and essentially our peaceful coexistence. So while many Christians might not think much about democracy, aspiring for peace is something that I think we can all agree on. In Matthew 5:9, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who make peace, for they will be called children of God." A vast majority of conflicts in the world today are resolved through democratic means and methods. I would argue that if we are called to make peace, shouldn't we then also care about democracy? For many years, I've been wondering why Christians often seem to think that politics doesn't have anything to do with them, or that they shouldn't have anything to do with politics. And if they do, it's only on certain topics identified as important by the church, such as abortion or same-sex marriage. And it seems to always be from the position of being against someone or something. I had to dig into the Bible a little bit to see if I was wrong about this, or if we actually do have a bigger role to play in politics. And the Bible talks a lot about social justice and responsibility. It calls us to care for the orphans or the fatherless, the widows, the foreigner, being the immigrants, the refugees. The poor can be poor in health, poor in money, poor in hope, the oppressed. However, the Bible doesn't just stop at telling us to care for these people. It also refers to bringing justice, to pleading their cause, to delivering the oppressed from the oppressor, and generally doing what is good, just, and right. And what many believers seem to forget is that the scripture explicitly asks us to open our mouths, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the poor and needy, from Proverbs 31:9. Instead, we seem to shut our mouths, judge hypocritically, and shout loudly for our own rights. I see three main responses to the challenge of political engagement in churches today. Political apathy, with withdrawal and distrust and lack of engagement. Consensus-driven Christianity, which would be presenting a carefully diluted gospel that will not offend anyone. And Christian nationalism, a new term that we've been hearing a lot in media recently, putting national identity and traditional white evangelical culture ahead of core biblical truth. As none of these responses seem to be rooted in scripture, my question is, how did we get here? And how can we do better? And maybe one way to start is by having conversations like this one. I would like to end my opening with a quote from Billy Graham, the theologian. Courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spines of others are often stiffened.
Do I really know the truth and not my truth? Then is it my job or calling or ministry or career, whatever you may call it, to spread this truth or the truth? With whom am I sharing the truth? Which leads us to a very important ethical issue. Am I sharing my truth or the truth? Is there one truth or are there more truths? Are we merely channels allowing the truth to flow and basically distribute itself? Or are we creators of truths that distribute only what our own worldview filters allow to pass through? And that is what I would call valuable parts of the truth. The problem I see with the latter is that it is too easy to recreate a brand new image from the pieces of an original paint. And as faithful subjects of this postmodernist era, we are all inclined to be recreators in music and visual arts, in industry, in medicine. Again, the problem could be that something which only has pieces of truth in it could be against the very truth itself. The fact that we put together pieces of truth and it becomes my truth opens the trail for endless debates about what is good and what is evil. If I'm a channel, I will always follow the source. That is what allows one to call him or herself a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. Somebody could affirm, okay, if you are only a channel, you are a robot, you are manipulated, you have no brains to think for yourself. The way I see it, is that even as channels, we are not equal in flavor or color. So we are allowed to transport the truth the way a good expensive drink like wine, if you may, is transported or stored in special barrels, which impart their taste according to so many preferences. The diluted pure truth reaching the recipients according to their own level of understanding. As a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, I know and I believe that truth is the person of Jesus, what he did and what he thought. Now the question remains, do we want to know the mind and the heart of Jesus, or do we prefer to manipulate his teaching and his example to fit into our limited window of perception? I will dare to say, Tihomir, we do not live in a post-truth era, but in a more dangerous neo-truth era, basically a neo-Jesus era. We feel attacked and embarrassed and outraged and disturbed. So we rejected, or at the best diluted, Jesus, the truth, plus something else. We cannot embrace the fact that it is the great divorce that saves us.
And then there's the other thought, and that is we can speak about truth without integrity. You can say something that is true and not necessarily believe it. You can say it because it's a good media headline. You can say it because it's going to win you friends on Twitter. You can say it because it fits you into the right space or the right bubble. But if there's no integrity behind it, then what actually are you living for, and what actually are you speaking out about? Are you going to actually cause a lot more mess than perhaps for just not saying anything at all? I work in the migration space primarily and on refugees, and that can get incredibly toxic. The other weekend, there was a problem where a person was, he stabbed somebody who turned out to be someone with real mental health issues, who was also here on a resettlement program. The other Sunday, we had another experience of that, where some people who had been housed had mental health problems and weren't properly looked after, and then ended up stabbing fellow asylum seekers. Before the news had even broken, people had made up their mind about that situation. Judgment had been cast, glass houses had been broken, stones had been thrown, and they were all demonized. We shouldn't be housing asylum seekers. They are illegal. They are invaders. Look, we told you this would happen. Nothing about mental health. Whereas we see attackers who have been white before, and the first question is, oh, they must have had a bad upbringing, or oh, maybe they had a mental health problem. So much grace shown to those of our own privilege and background. But what about those different to us? What about those that make us feel complex or awkward? And that's the question. When the media headline is invader, how do I respond to that without feeling a sense of real anger, but also not losing my own personal integrity in that? We've also seen headlines around BAME communities and COVID-19. There was a report that was leaked and then published that showed the majority of doctors in this country who have died from COVID are BAME, and that's Black and ethnic minorities. The people who are on intensive care are ethnic minorities. And the report said itself, this is most likely the result of racial injustice. Why is that? Why are BAME communities the first people to suffer? Why are they the people in housing estates that burn down without any assistance? Is it wrong to call that out? And that's the question. And it shouldn't even be a party political question. So often you hear that put into a box of left or right. If I speak out about economic or racial inequality, am I a lefty liberal? Or let's put it more rudely, I'm a communist. If I speak out about economic wealth or prosperity, am I always on the right? Am I a conservative? No. There is somewhere in the middle. I should care about all. And in fact, James in his book tells us we should show no favoritism, no partiality. We should be caring about the whole. Everybody is born and made in the image of God. And that's that, really. I think we start and end with that. Everybody is born and made in the image of God, and that is what should really drive us when we are putting things out on Twitter or in the media and trying to hold to account. Justin Welby, in his book Reimagining Britain, wrote a chapter on asylum and refugees, and one of his main purposes in that was to basically say, we've got to watch our language. He said we must resist and turn back the worrying trends we are seeing around the world towards seeing the movement of desperate people as more of a threat to identity and security than an opportunity to do our duty. He goes on to say, refugees, like all people, are treasured human beings made in the image of God who deserve safety, freedom, and the opportunity to flourish. Jesus commands us to care for the most vulnerable amongst us. And really, that's where I want to leave this and say, if we are not caring for the most vulnerable amongst us, if we are not being nuanced in our conversations, watching our words, if we're not holding one another to account, iron sharpening iron, then what are we doing and what are we here for?
But I would propose that the church in many ways then, in essence, has lost the love of truth and the concept of truth itself. I've been inspired by the speaker and author, an expert of change management, Peter Senge. He himself is openly inspired by New Age thinking, but his observation towards the church is interesting. It's expressed in the book, The Fifth Discipline, and referring to Jesus, who says in John 8:32 that we should know the truth and the truth shall set us free. He says, Peter Senge says, that the Christians historically had a strong understanding about truth and facing the truth as a mean to change behavior. He thinks we've actually lost this concept of truth and the power of change that comes with facing reality and truth. Instead, knowing truth was altered from facing reality as it is to embracing the belief in a savior. So as long as you believe in Jesus, then you're fine, then you're in truth. You don't have to face truth as a concept or the reality around you anymore. I'm no expert of the history of the American culture wars, but James Davidson Hunter, who wrote in the book To Change the World, The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World, it was 10 years ago approximately, he wrote this book. He believes American Christians, both on the left and on the right, have politicized faith, which you have pointed out so many times, Tiamir. And this has been happening to the extent that faith is too much connected with just that, a few political issues. If you win these issues, and we've touched on them, abortion and family rights, then society becomes re-Christianized, especially goes the thinking on the Christian right. We see this tendency in Europe as well, maybe as not as clearly. And as God a Populist, we point to how populist movements are coupling nationalism with the Christian heritage in their nation states, Hungary and Poland being very obvious examples. Now, research from both Germany and the UK shows that active churchgoers actually vote populist parties to a less extent than the average citizen. So one could say that the active Christians in Europe do not bite this populist tendency as strongly as perhaps our brothers and sisters in the States right now. But in any case, I would say that the growth of populist parties using the Christian lingo to spread their message actually undermines the very democracies Christian thinking through the ages have played a real and strong part in establishing. One that would point this out is historian Tom Holland in his book Dominion, which has been a bestseller lately. He has shown that Christianity has played a big part in shaping Europe. Now, this heritage is being used by populists, in my opinion. Now, if we get to the practicalities, what could our response be if we want to be citizens of both the world, our nations, and believers? What could a Christian response look like? I would propose 3 ways. One, to resurrect the meaning of truth and thus become a constructive force with other good forces for the common good and for the safekeeping of democracy. So we must again fight for the common standards of reality. If we look at the example from Peter Sanji and John 8:32, Jesus equals truth. That means, in my opinion, if we endeavor to follow Jesus, then it's the truth, but also everything else which is true is in essence on God's side. God is for seeing reality as it is. To know the truth, yes, in the deepest sense, is to know Jesus. But Jesus is truth, and knowing him means we have to face reality. We have to be true about what is. Sanji uses this in change management. In order to change, to see change in a personal life, in an organization, or in society, we have to face reality as it is. This will set us free. If you face the fact that you are drinking too much, you realize you're an alcoholic, that is the start of a process that could lead to you being free of alcohol misuse. This used to be obvious, but now we have to say, we have to face the reality. COVID-19, the coronavirus, is real. In order to deal with it, we have to believe, one, it's real. Two, we have to keep social distance. We have to stay healthy. That will lead to our freedom from it. We can stay healthy. So we need to address fake news, I believe. So how do we do it? Well, we could also, on the second point, try to be bridge builders. I think we have a special role to play to help bridge the communication between polarized groups, especially within the body of Christ. It's hard. Even in Norway, which is a pretty homogeneous country, we see polarized conversation. It's really hard to communicate with believers who are populistic. But as Luke Brotherton, professor of theology at Duke University in the United States, shares in his chapter, he says we have to try to understand the populists and to understand why did it evolve. What are the causes that would lead to people voting on populist parties? And even sometimes we would be able to side with populists. He would say that Martin Luther King was an example of leading a populist movement. Sometimes populism isn't bad. This isn't black and white. So understanding and trying to understand what are the underlying issues that are leading to people voting as they do, for example. And thirdly, I believe as believers, we need to engage in politics, but not to politicize faith. We need to follow the example of God as we find it in Genesis chapter 1, the creator God who creates and makes things better and improves. So that means following his example, we need to try to solve the problems of our day and thus be salt and light.
We live in a world that is full of problems. Unfortunately, you have seen me many times active in protests in the fields because the problems are a lot, unfortunately. And what I believe is that Christians should not be closed in their church walls, but they should be on the field, fighting for what they think is important, and fighting in the model of one leader that we always use in our leadership academy as the model of successful leadership, and that one is Jesus. If we try to see the leadership model of Jesus, we would see some characteristics. One, Jesus was in direct contact with people. He was not staying at home or in the office closed, and he wasn't just praying. He was there on the field, knowing the reality, speaking to people, and helping the real people, and understanding what the reality is and what the people really need. When he knew the needs, he was experiencing the servant leadership. He knew the needs of the community, and he was there to help them as much as he could. On the other hand, what did Jesus do as a leadership model that we as Christians have? He didn't just pray for the problems of the world. He raised his voice against injustice. One of the most typical reactions was Jesus in the temple, when he thought that the injustice that was taking part at that moment had to be told. So what we believe in is a model of leadership with values, and in the struggles that we have nowadays between values and anti-values, we as Christians need to take a stand, because this struggle is very important at the moment, and people need us to take a stand. We are called in the Bible light of the world, and we are not light of the world just as a symbolic expression. We should be the light of the world because we need to shine so the world sees which is the right path to the real truth. So the question, should we just pray or should we do really something, is a big debate that I have with my friends when they see me in the field or when they see me protesting many times. I think that we have a very interesting expression that is, in the end of a problematic, what people will remember is not the word of their enemies, is the silence of their friends. So shall we as Christians be silent as we see injustice and just try to manage it in a silent way? Or shall we do something, say the truth, and do something on our own? As Heather was saying, people might ask themselves, where are the Christians? And this is a question that they shouldn't ask. They should see us, and we should be present and involved properly. As I was saying, one of our activities is the Leadership Academy of young people in politics, of women in politics. We do it with different range of ages and of group interests. We always speak about leadership models with integrity. And this kind of leadership is very unknown nowadays. If you ask, especially young people, tell me a name of the leader, they will tell you the name of a politician. Then you say, tell me the name of a leader with integrity. They wouldn't know. And they wouldn't trust and they wouldn't believe in a model of leadership with integrity. And what we do is help them understand that leaders with integrity are the leaders that we need today. And yes, it is possible.
Truth telling. We talked about truth, and it's important. That's the crux of the subject, so that's why it's in the middle. Firstly, we need to have truth findings, and that is difficult today. You know, when we talk about Jesus equals truth, that is true. Jesus equals love as well. But, you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, 60, 70 years ago, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And it seems to me that we need to be continually seeking who Jesus is in order to espouse to that kind of truth. Because we've domesticated Jesus. We've done it in Europe. And that's why Nietzsche was kind of, critical of that process. If you look at the kind of philosophical trajectory and the death of God movement in the 60s and whatnot, as Herman said, even today, that's kind of still very, very prevalent. What have we done with Jesus? If we have created Jesus in our own image, so he's some kind of gun-loving libertarian, maybe we need to re-examine who is Jesus Christ for us today in 2020. And that way we could maybe replicate more of a biblical Jesus. And that means that we try to shed that layers of the onion of what we've created onto Jesus with the church, with the tradition, and find the real Jesus of the narrative of the biblical texts, of the Gospels, etc. So search for real and not inauthentic or fake Jesus. I want to also mention another point, and that is nationalism. Issue of nationalism is huge in Europe and in America. In America, incredibly. It is a problem, And it has always been a problem of wars and disrespect of other human beings when we have elevated nationalism to our first primary identifying mark. I am a Croatian. I'm also British because I have pledged the allegiance to the Queen and her government and am a British citizen, Hedda. I'm also 20 plus years in America and have assimilated and accumulated and also pushed back to that culture. I'm also male. I'm white. Are those identifying marks primarily for me, or is my belonging to the kingdom of God my first and foremost identifying mark? And that changes everything. If I am a Croatian, if I am white, male, British, American, whatever, first, that means that that will color everything else that I have to say or seek or understand or even argue with. But if indeed my first allegiance is to the kingdom of God, then all of these other things are something that are given to me or I have chosen them, but they're only part and parcel of that larger reality of me being a member of the kingdom of God and therefore member of Jesus's movement. And that identity will shape how and not only what I will say in the truth telling.
It seems strange to me, why are Americans so afraid of redistributive policies? Many Americans are clearly terrified of socialist ideas. Scrolling through social media, I see Americans using socialist and leftist and communist all mixed up together with other derogatory words such as corrupt and immoral. And it makes me very upset for two main reasons. First of all, it's obvious that they don't know what these words mean. And so they are contributing to spreading misinformation in a very hateful way. And secondly, it's clear that they see left-wingers as equally evil as those who are corrupt or immoral. And by extension, that must mean that they see people like me, who tend more towards the left, as somebody who is evil. And it's hard not to take that personally. So where I stand on the political spectrum really depends on the country in question. In the US, I would without a doubt qualify as a leftist. And many Americans might wrongfully go so far as to call me communist, which has happened. Meanwhile, in Norway, where I come from, I have generally tended to be more center-right. And so just in case some people are not aware, it is actually possible to have strong social security while also maintaining a strong capitalist economy and freedom of choice. All that into consideration, I can see that many Republicans have a genuine fear of communism and socialism. Considering where American politics is oriented, I would argue that there is much more reason to be concerned with fascism. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I decided I will define these concepts for you. So communism is a theory or a system of social organization in which all property is owned by the community and each person contributes and receives according to their ability and needs. Fascism is a governmental system led by a dictator, having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often racism. These definitions are taken from Oxford Dictionary and dictionary.com. So statistics from Pew Research Center from January of this year show that the overwhelming majority of Trump supporters in Europe are people from extreme right populist parties, all of which have a history of fascism and neo-fascism in the leadership and among supporters. So what does that mean? Does it mean that all Trump supporting Republicans are extreme right neo-fascists? Of course not. You know, we should not go to extremes like this and jump to conclusions like this. However, I still believe it is worth noticing, and it should give some red flags, It hasn't been that long since our countries were engaged in a major world war, started by a strong charismatic leader in Germany who believed in Germany for Germans. And we all know how that went. And maybe you're thinking, oh, that was totally different, but was it really so different as some of the things we're seeing today? Patriotism is a wonderful thing. I am proud to be Norwegian. But as soon as we start thinking we're better than the rest of the world, we're onto something dangerous. And when national pride becomes entangled with national identity that has to look and smell and sound and feel a specific way, it's no longer patriotism, it's nationalism. And nationalism, history has taught us, is a very, very dangerous thing.
Do I care about Trump and his current thing? Well, actually, Trump's just a symptom. He's an attractive endorsement of populism, and he's good at what he does. But frankly, if he was in, there are several countries in Europe with very similar things going on. I'm not sure that Bolsonaro or others would be particularly different if we actually, compared them there. They all use religion. They all use religion as a method. But here's a quote from a man. I'll tell you at the end who the quote is from. This man said, "It would disturb me." This is in February 1981. "It would disturb me if there was a wedding between the religious fundamentalists and the political right. The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it." That's a quote from a man called Billy Graham. Okay. Now, why was that happening? Because in 1971, 74, 76, the Southern Baptists had looked at issues including abortion and decided that abortion was okay and the rights of the women to determine what was there should be the significant determinant. But 6 years after Roe v. Wade, the famous case in America, under Ronald Reagan, there was a guy there called Lee Atwater. He was the boss of the Republican campaign, and he developed a thing called the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was really a smart way to use the Southern white nervousness about racial equality, but to abstract it and turn it into something. The real argument was about things like segregated schools, but they abstracted it and they turned it into something which eventually became the whole abortion thing, which moved from being a Roman Catholic driven thing to suddenly become an evangelical Protestant driven thing. Now, I don't think there will be a person on this call who thinks positively about abortion as a process. What I'm talking about here is the political work that was done on that idea. And so what happened was Reagan's Republican Party, with this Southern Strategy, Reagan was invited by the head of the Dallas churches, and actually by the #1 fundamentalist at that time, fundamentalist teacher. I can't remember if it was Criswell or Cresswell, like that, invited to the Dallas church. And basically, they used that as a way of building up a whole new thing and flipping the South from being largely fairly democratic to becoming strongly Republican, but white evangelical Republican.
Why does it matter what the world thinks about the US president? Why does it matter what people think about US politics or the US in general? Well, the reason why the whole world is paying attention to the US election and what is happening there is not because we love the drama, although maybe for some people that is the reason, but it's because this election and whatever is happening in the US has huge repercussions for the whole world. Over the last century, the US has been a beacon of light for democracy and human rights. Romania and many other post-communist countries have been looking to the US as an example for democratic leadership. Adding to that, for many years, American missionaries have been coming to Romania and establishing deep roots and strong connection with the evangelical churches here. So the US is not just a role model for democracy and human rights, it's also a role model for spiritual leadership. So when the US president, and in extension, everyone who support him, actively undermine peace and democracy, openly endorses dangerous conspiracy theories and extreme right groups such as the Proud Boys, and refuses to answer the question of whether or not he will step down if he loses the election, it does unfortunately have a major impact on people in other countries and what they will consider to be good leadership and democracy. So I would say once upon a time, the US was a beacon of light for democracy and human rights. Now it does seem like that beacon is fading. And people are worried, and they're right to be worried. It doesn't really matter if you're right-wing or left-wing, if you're Republican or Democrat. What matters is standing up for what is right. If you're a Republican and you see that your Republican leader is acting in a way that is offensive or destructive and even dangerous, it's your responsibility to speak up. Your silence tells the world that you agree with these behaviors and these attitudes and this rhetoric. Regardless of what side we're on, we need to hold our leaders accountable. Even more so if we are the ones who put them there. So lastly, I would just say, please be careful with your words. They say that words cut deeper than knives, and that is true. But sometimes words also lead people to using knives and guns and other weapons against each other. Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist who killed 77 people, mostly children, in 2011, was inspired by certain words and conspiracy theories that were being spread online. As someone with a background in peace studies, I am now seriously concerned about where this polarization might lead. The US is still a world leader. So I would say, please, for the sake of all of us, be a good role model, take responsibility and hold each other accountable. Let's not forget that we, as followers of Jesus, are called to be peacemakers and each other's humble servants.
Second, I wrote my dissertation on how evangelicals respond to poverty. And unfortunately, evangelicals are 3 times as likely to blame the poor for their poverty than non-Christians. And that's very much tied to ethnocentrism and racism and authoritarianism and the type of bootstrap individualism that Americans are famous for, which is really an egocentric individualism. However, I think it's important to point out this authoritarianism that is very closely tied to nationalism is growing globally, probably in response to globalism in the last several years. We're not the only country suffering from this nationalism, but we are certainly have widespread effects from our nationalism. The reality is that the majority of Americans are living hand to mouth. The majority. They are unhealthy with unaffordable health care and often in the position to make desperate choices, and that's being fueled by the white evangelical vote. So something is wrong with this picture. You know, we need to rethink how our Christianity is being done here entirely. Additionally, you know, we're supposed to be the group that cares about family values. So if we're basing our voting decisions on sexual ethics and family values, I really find it hard to understand the choice of President Trump. We have a real problem with facts and data. US Christians and having less ability to want to accept facts and data is also a part of authoritarianism, which is also closely tied to the fascism that Camilla was talking about. White Christians in the US are less likely to have the facts about what's occurring and statistically prefer to create some kind of a fantasy world to process this existential anxiety we're having in a rapidly changing world that, you know, many are reacting to with the nationalism. I would love to see the global church, which is outpacing the white evangelical church, which by numbers is going down significantly, really rise up and become the leaders, and minority churches in America become the leaders in what it really means to show the true love of Christ, and what it really means in our public lives to bring those sacred held private values, such as fighting hunger, fighting poverty, fighting against wage theft, and that's what it is, to the public conversation. Another example of putting out false data and kind of being attracted to the false data conspiracy theory that Christians have a tendency to is that coronavirus is a plot by the deep state to take away people's rights. Who knew that this whole pandemic and actually wearing face masks would be a litmus test for somebody's character? In America, it is, in particular Christians. So all that's happened since 2016 has really shown the fruits of what's down deep in the roots of this type of Christianity. And I just believe that we have to not give into fear, and people have pandered specifically to Christians as a strategy. Jack, you're absolutely right. This was a strategy to target abortion, and it was a secular strategy. It wasn't a Christian strategy. The secular strategy in the 1980s was to gain the evangelical vote, which previously had been for Democrats, through abortion, which, as you mentioned, the Southern Baptist Church was not against at the time. In Proverbs chapter 6, it talks about 7 things that God finds detestable: a lying tongue, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs conflict in their community are things that God finds detestable. So people who believe in scripture and say that the truth will set you free need to be seeking for that truth and promoting the truth and embracing the truth. Christians should absolutely ask questions, but be careful from whom you seek answers. And we need to check our motives. I need to check my motives. You know, I need to dig into the data when I find something that motivates me and stirs me up. Christians shouldn't be the ones hating and judging and showing our arrogance with nationalism, judging the less fortunate and immigrant, particularly children in cages. Instead, we need to be on the forefront of advocating for the most vulnerable. Babies already born in the US, I would say, are the most vulnerable. And at the very least, if you're pro-life, you have to be pro-child after birth.
You can hold people to account, and that's good, but you can also hold them to account for accountability's sake. Do we pursue an agenda? Has the church pursued an agenda at times because it feels close to that seat, because of that imagined threat that's been touched upon at times? And has it, in doing so, sometimes sowed more discord than, as Camilla talks about, peace? Has it been virtue signaling? We had a campaign here in the UK around free school meals, and a footballer took up the charge on that, and I happen to support this particular team, so I'm very proud he did that. But the Twitter feed was all about virtue signaling. They said, oh, he's just virtue signaling to protect children. He didn't actually. He was actually doing the thing he says he would. Virtue signaling would be like me going to say to you, I'm off to the gym right now, and just taking my bag and then hopping off to get a coffee or something. That's virtue signaling in that sense. So where are we going? Where is the church? Where is politics going after 2020 or even now? Are we going to just be virtue signalers? Are we going to pursue power for power's sake? Are we really all about ambition? Now, Deuteronomy 16:20 says, justice, justice shall you pursue. It's not a mistake. It does say it twice, justice, justice. The call there looks at heaven and earth, but also action and motive. If you talk to any Jewish person, they get this. They always say justice, justice. And I remember sitting in a meeting about this. We were looking at a migration issue, and a rabbi turned to me and he said, Heather, it's a justice issue. And I said, what do you mean justice? And he said, it's about righteousness. It's about what we do, and it's about what our heart is doing, that motive. Justice. It's doubly important what the church does. It's doubly important how we act and what we say and what we do and who we hold to account. Perhaps the use of the word justice means that we cannot pursue justice without being righteous, as I said. Righteous, right relationship with God, right relationship with one another. It's not a single concept. And maybe we've lost that a little bit. Do we disrupt those who seek to undermine justice? Do we call it out? Would this be a cry post 2020? In a word of a song I quite like, where do you want to go? How much do you want to risk? Are we looking for somebody with a superhuman gift? In the quest for legacy, how much are we willing to sacrifice? Are we looking for our little messiahs with those superhuman gifts? What is it actually we want in society? What would be a legacy for our leaders? Is it one where character assassination just takes primacy, or erosion of trust in experts and the rule of law? Is it a rule of law that we can pick and choose? Is it international law that we can pick up and put down when it suits us? Or is it about actually loving and caring and looking out for our neighbour? So why was it the other day when I woke up with a total sense of relief and excitement when I watched the Prime Minister of New Zealand give her election winning speech? It wasn't because, and I'm going to out myself here, I'm a member of the Labour Party and we don't win very much, but it was an excitement because of what she was saying. Let's not be torn apart by elections. Let's listen to one another. Let's go deeper. Let's learn to see the other's perspective. That doesn't mean rolling over, but it does mean doing it with due care and actually believing that one another is made also in the image of God. Do we go deeper? Can we question, where is the love? One of my favorite scriptures is Isaiah, and I'm going to come to a close in a moment. And it says, you will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up age-old foundations. You will be called the repairer of broken walls and a restorer of streets and dwellings. That's great. But what happens when we don't all agree if something needs to be restored? What happens if we're not sure how to restore that? That's something we need to work through to go further. In a sermon by the Bishop of York, he looked at a positive from the crisis. He looked at that rebuilding and mentioned William Temple. William Temple became an archbishop, and he, during the Second World War, in the midst of rubble, in the midst of dissolution, he dreamed of what peace would look like and how devastated cities could be rebuilt. He was one of the moral architects of a post-war consensus that gave birth to a welfare state and to the National Health Service. A concept born out of devastation and crisis, so needed especially today. And I might cheekily add, in reference to Camilla, that there's nothing communist about believing in a healthcare free-for-all at the point of use. Will our rebuilding and believing and leading care for the vulnerable? Will we be seeking to save the oppressed and promote empathy and compassion? And because I love him so much, I'm going to end on the Bishop of York as well. As quickly as Christ sets us free from all the self-made constructions of separation, the willful pride of the human hearts that builds them up again. This is why the Church of Jesus Christ must and does confront division and oppression today. People of faith should embody moral and intellectual integrity, not cruelty, not power for power's sake. And I would add, nor set themselves up as any type of Messiah, but they should instead act as a nation's chief servant.
Is that in this divided era, we're bowing to the same false god from opposite sides of the altar. So in other words, the left and the right have both made an idol of the idea of politics and ideology. And as you think about how both sides communicate with each other, amongst themselves and about the other side, it's increasingly in almost in religious terms, where if you don't agree with one party, then you're evil, or if you disagree with the orthodoxy of one side and you question it, then you're a heretic, or you're a sellout, you're backslidden. You know, there's evangelical terminology that's used to describe, you know, impure conservatives if you don't buy into every element of what the party agenda would be. And the left I would say, is becoming increasingly illiberal, where there's cancel culture, there's a lack of tolerance of free speech. And so at a time when we think both of these are polarized and they're opposite, and there are genuine differences, I would suggest part of what they have in common is that both sides have an idolatry problem. And that is a way, I think, of thinking about the world, making sense of it, that's helpful for us as believers. And this is not a new thought. You know, back in the 17th century, Blaise Pascal, the famous philosopher, said, you know, we have a God-shaped vacuum. And that's a summary of this brilliant observation he made. He talked about, we have an infinite abyss that can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object. In other words, by God himself. And in the last century, Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, he was writing in the 1950s and 60s when the totalitarian regimes were coming to the world stage, you know, North Korea, the Soviet Union. And there was a mantra that said, God is dead. These states would declare that God was dead. And Jung said, no, we all have a religious instinct, just in a similar way that Blaise Pascal talked about the God-shaped vacuum. We all have this instinct to worship something, to make sense of the world. And Carl Jung said to the communist regimes, is you have not killed God, you've just replaced God with other gods. In other words, you've replaced God with the state. And he said the socialist dictatorships are religions. You know, the state slavery is a form of worship. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demagogue. And there's only one truth and there's no other, and it's sacrosanct and above criticism. And then anyone who thinks differently is a heretic. And so what Jung said about the regimes in the 60s, sadly, there's some commonality with what we see today, whether people, if they're pro-Trump, then they view people who are not 100% on their team as heretical, and vice versa. Unless you're constantly, you know, incessantly criticizing Trump, then you're not a good Christian. Then you're not really with the program. And I think as believers, we have to be very skeptical of that language of certitude and that kind of idolatry perspective.
So one example that I really think of a lot in kind of the selective way that evangelicals separate their faith from public life is the belief that government shouldn't help the poor. And I'd like to just talk about that example for a second. There's a very selective interpretation there where, you know, there's many years of history behind this thought that thousands of years that assistance is a private matter of charity, a rigid separation between the roles of the church and the state, supporting economic theories of laissez-faire economy and trickle-down economics, which does in fact work well for very, very rich people, but often, unfortunately, at the expense of 90% of everybody else. White evangelicals in the United States have proved themselves powerful advocates in some areas. And there's measurements that this group of evangelicals is the most politically powerful group in the history of the world, that it has more power at this time than any other group ever has, for some reason often crying persecution. And with that political capital is advocating for private schooling, private healthcare, private charity over public assistance, individual punishment over social compassion. And the loudest public discourse sometimes comes in the form of calls to abandon the public good. What I find really interesting is that there are studies that show that those who attend church most often do not understand the mechanics of public justice or civic responsibility because of a widespread emphasis on self-enhancement and individualism. I think that theological centrality of evangelicalism in America is probably the source of all of our issues as a church. Not understanding the mechanics of public good is dangerous, as we see poignantly right now in the Christian perpetuation of very harmful conspiracy theories. And not understanding the mechanics of public good is harmful in that it seriously hurts the most vulnerable. In every case, the poorest nations in the world have little to no governance. Politics is directly related to poverty. it's indisputable that bad governance is related to poverty. For example, yesterday in Houston, there's 4-hour food lines. And I'm sure that there's something close to that in my own town of Dayton, Ohio. That is related to policies, because many of the people who are in those food lines, many of the people who are hungry right now are hard at work. They're working 9-to-5 jobs. And one wonders, where is the Protestant work ethic advocacy when people are working a full day's work but can't feed their children? The global growth of poverty this year is from real policies and structures and societies, and is not just a spiritual notion that, you know, we keep to the prayer closet. In the US, spirituality that is only for the prayer closet, when 84 million Americans are going hungry here, and there's 750 million people in the world that are hungry internationally, is no kind of real faith at all. Rather than promoting really disturbing QAnon conspiracy theories or negatively influencing democracy by attempting to negate election results or promoting anti-vaccine theories, I suggest a more fruitful public presence that addresses the numbers of individuals hard at work who are living hand to mouth, which is also.
So this Facebook commenter that I just mentioned provides this perfect example of a trend that I find deeply concerning. And it's the rise of self-proclaimed prophets with a clear political agenda, and the lack of accountability of our celebrity megachurch leaders. I'm not so ignorant to think that I know the whole truth, as it says in 1 Corinthians 13, 9-10, for we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial passes away. We as humans are not capable of understanding the whole picture, the full and complete truth. Not yet. And it would be silly to claim such a thing. There was a time in my life when people were trying to teach me how to prophesy. And they would say, just close your eyes and listen. Trust that the first thing that comes into your mind is the word of God for you, and it is. I don't believe, actually, that prophesying is a skill we can be trained in, and I don't believe that any thought that pops into my head is the voice of God. But because of this kind of teaching, I think it's safe to assume that there are many people out there who are convinced that they are prophesying in the name of God, when in reality they're just sharing their humanly flawed and deeply subjective thoughts and opinions. In the last few months, my social media feed has been full of people claiming to know the will of God, specifically regarding the outcome of the US presidential election. Dreams were interpreted and reinterpreted, words of knowledge were shared and reshared. Even after the election, when the outcome was clear, those who had claimed in the name of God that the current president would win kept holding on to this conviction. Instead of admitting their mistake, they would make up all kinds of stories, excuses, even lies, to convince everyone that they were right the whole time. Even to this day, large numbers of people refuse to accept the outcome of the election because God told them otherwise. And now I'm not going to discuss whether or not the outcome of the election is legitimate. You're entitled to your own opinion on that. But the fact that their argument is only that it was because God told them otherwise, I find that deeply disturbing. Because they somehow make it look like God is complicit in their mistake. And isn't that exactly what the third commandment is about? You shall not use God's name in vain. So this leads me to 2 Timothy 4:3-4, which warns us that a time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myth. So it's troubling to me that it has become commonplace for church leaders to prophesy about or officially commit to the success of a certain political party or individual. Jesus is on our side, they say when they talk about their own political quest. And this kind of certainty on behalf of God is baffling to me. How do they know with such confidence that Jesus agrees with their political standing? And what has made them so convinced that God is suddenly party political? I personally cannot find anything in the Bible that would support this claim, and I doubt anyone else would either, but you're free to tell me if I'm wrong. What we do know is that God wants us to care for the orphans and the widows, as Jill said. We know he's against injustice, he's against poverty and oppression. We know he hates idolatry, wickedness, and lies. We certainly don't know if he would be a Republican or a Democrat. And to be honest, I really doubt he would align himself with any political party because he's perfect and our parties are not.
The measuring stick is, of course, to be seen in context of real-world phenomenon or factors. And in the book, we were looking at the rapid growth of anti-democratic nationalist populism. And this has somehow kind of arisen from a disengagement, I would say, in politics, amongst others. And the reason we felt it important to address Christianity is that there's been an increase of populist parties claiming to represent Christian values. Now, some populist movements can be positive. And here I'm referring to movements that say there's discrimination that needs to be addressed. And it's good that discrimination, that this is raised and dealt with. But when anti-democratic national populist movements claim to be Christian or to champion Christian values or causes, we have to ask, do they really do that? Now, of course, Christian identity means different things to different people. It can be personal identity, a belief, a sense of Christian heritage, or it can be a collective identity. Christianity isn't static, it evolves over time. And as it evolves, different people will seek to control the narratives about what Christianity actually is. So when Christianity is referenced by national populists, often the appeals aren't to a belief in God. They're often to a cultural Christianity, perhaps, and by that I mean an appeal to Christian roots, or Crusader-style Christianity. And this really advocates a return to a monocultural Christian Europe, a return, I say, to a Christian culture that never existed. We've never had that, but we seem to claim it does. It's sort of a mythical thing that they claim. Even amongst Christians, there are different types of Christian practices. Even in a very centralized church like the Catholic Church, we see different practices. Now, this monocultural vision cannot favor the common good because it advocates modern forms of racism or exclusion. Cass Muda, who's an expert on populism, he discusses this and he argues, as soon as the right-wing populists reach power, they practice what he calls an extreme form of majoritarian democracy in which minority rights can only exist as long as they have majority support. Now, this type of populism is, of course, opposed to liberal democracy as we know it here in Western Europe, where powers are separated and individual rights and freedoms are officially recognised and protected. National populist parties are by definition anti-pluralistic, and whilst they promise to recover democracy, they actually restrict it. Only one voice knows what the people wants, and that is their voice. Christians and non-Christians, we have to take this seriously. As Jürgen Moltmann wrote in the book, nationalist promises to place their people's interest first rely on at least one false premise. They encourage us to overlook the fact that we're not just nationals, we are part of a humankind that shares a common earth. I think this could be what Paul meant when he said, Christian citizenship is in heaven. Anti-democratic populists also refuse the possibility of a common life with others. They narrow down what is common, our humanity, down to exclusionary visions of who is or who is not part of the people. This runs against politics as neighbour love, which helps to rebuild the conditions of flourishing as we consider what isn't working.
Who is losing out or excluded? And as we look together at how we can make things better for everyone.
I was walking down the street the other day, and this is not a story about whether we should pray for the homeless or feed the homeless or goodness knows what. But for me, it caught me off guard. And I think, again, it speaks to that notion of predicament and hope. And as I walked past a guy who was outside my local supermarket, he sits there week in, week out, day in, day out, hungry and, you know, very friendly, always polite. And I walked past him, went to get my food, came out and saw some people praying for him very loudly, standing on the street, you know, hands in the air, really going for it. And the poor guy, I remember just walking past and I just caught his eye, and there was just a look in his eye which simply said, help. And I just, you know, being very British and quite introverted, was like, oh, just go walk past, you know, sorry, you know, I feel you, but I'm going to walk past. And I walked on, and then I just stopped, and I just felt, and it doesn't happen to me very often, but I felt a very clear, go back, give him the fruit that you just bought, that you won't eat anyway, so, you know, just go back and give it to him. And I had this internal battle, which was, I don't want to make a fuss. I don't want to intervene. I don't want to do, you know, it's COVID, it's very unsafe. All these things that were going through my head to try and excuse why I should interrupt this conversation. And then I remember thinking, my whole role is policy. I make policy. I tell my boss, who's a member of parliament, you know, to care, to consider, to be compassionate, to be just, to ask the why, and to also live out a practical action. But if I'm not doing this, who am I? Why am I in this role in the first place? So I went back and I sort of slipped underneath these very dramatic prayers and gave them the fruit. And the guy just, you know, he was massively thankful. And the woman next to me suddenly yelled very loudly, much to my horror, you know, see, you know, God provides, he's provided the food that you wanted. And it turned out he did really want some fruit. But the story in that is not, should we pray, should we not? It's a simple, where are our values? Are we stopping to see people? And I was really struck just about that. In my role, it's all about big picture, it's about strategy, and you can get lost for everything that we're doing. And as Christians, I think sometimes we can get lost. We can get lost in the debates about, am I good enough? Am I the right sort of evangelical? Am I voting the right way? We can get really lost when actually sometimes we're called to just stop, look and listen. Surely that is to come back to a place of seeing and feeling. I had a discussion with one of my bosses the other day about compassion, and she was saying, is compassion too nice? You know, what does it really mean? And I ended up basically quoting scripture and saying, but the Lord is gracious and compassionate. It's an active word, it's a doing word, it's a ferocious word. And compassion requires action, and it requires us seeing people. It requires sometimes moving away from perhaps where we wanted to be in our comfort zone to do something else. In our current predicament as well, I've been thinking about, you know, how do we calm a crisis? I've been starting to watch The Crown, so on Netflix, and there's a scene in there between the Labour leader at the time, Harold Wilson, and he's talking to Her Majesty the Queen, and she is in a bit of a dilemma about showing emotion or not showing emotion. What do we do in this situation? And he simply said to her, what we have to do as leaders, our job is surely to calm more crisis than we create. For me, it seems at the moment we're creating a lot more crisis than we're calming. There seems to be every day another crisis that we're making of our own mind, whether that, you know, for me personally, I would feel that might be a Brexit scenario, or whether that's an economic scenario, or whether that's simply ignoring the rule of law, whether that's ambition getting in the way to such an extent that we no longer have calm in a crisis, but we just have crisis upon crisis for more people to fix. We create enemies rather than drawing people to one another.
Who are my heroes and why? You know, we need to be virtuous people, but what is virtuous or good life in 2020? It is replicating the traditions that I espouse, that I love, that I appreciate. And I'm looking at statues going down and, people having different heroes here and there. And then that is making me ask, who are my heroes and why? And how can I be more like my heroes? And here is one of them. How can I live with integrity? How can I live the radical Christian life? Not domesticated Jesus following, but radical Jesus following. How can I have courage? And that's very often the primary virtue that I'm seeking, because I see that I'm too many times very timid and too lacking in courage to speak truth to people that I know, not to the powers. To powers I can speak easily because they're outside, but people whom I loved and respected and still love in a Christian sense, but whom I vehemently disagree with and whom I cannot believe are saying what they're saying. How do I go at that with them? And here's how I will do it. I'm finishing with a quote, like a number of you did, of one of my heroes. I mentioned him already, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's not the only one, but I'm focusing again and again now in last 3 to 6 months on reading back Dietrich. And I found through a friend a very important quote from his letter to his brother. He wrote to Karl Friedrich Bonhoeffer in 1935. Remember, 1935, way before the Second World War. The following: the brother was concerned about the younger brother, Dietrich, being too radical in the confessing church and the negative exposure it was giving him. And so this is what Dietrich wrote: perhaps I seem to you rather fanatical and mad about a number of things. I myself am sometimes afraid of that. But I know that the day I become more reasonable, to be honest, I should have to chuck my entire theology. When I first started in theology, my idea of it was quite different, rather more academic probably. Now it has turned into something else altogether. But I do believe that at last I'm on the right track for the first time in my life. I often feel quite happy about it. I only worry about being so afraid of what other people will think as to get bogged down instead of going forward. I think I'm right in saying that I would only achieve truer inner clarity and honesty by really starting to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously. Here alone lies the force that can blow all this hocus pocus, in brackets, of Nazism sky high, like fireworks, leaving only a few burnt out shells behind. These things do exist that are worth standing up for without compromise. To me, it seems that peace and social justice are such things, as is Christ himself. I end on Bonhoeffer's quote. I hope I can replicate it. I can get courageous to speak truth, not only to the powers, but also to the friends, to former students, to colleagues in ministry, to churches around me, etc.
It's Christmas at the moment and I'm involved in a lot of carol services, and one of my favorite carols is O Holy Night. There is the third verse in that that has not often been sung in some churches, and it's quite a provocative verse in many ways, and it says, his law is love and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. And I love that line, his law is love and his gospel is peace. If we're to change anything, if we're to grow as leaders, maybe we need to remember that his law is love and his gospel really is peace. Do we only care about what we're against? Is it picking the easy target? Is it picking the refugee or the migrant for what I personally try to fight for in my political career? Is it picking an easy target that is different to us, a political adversary? There's a scene in the Band of Brothers, if anyone's watched it, and they're teaching soldiers to kill people. And there's this guy and he's shouting, he's like, you don't want to do it like that. You want to kill him. That's how we're taught in politics. You want to kill him. You want to take down your enemy and you want to win. But do we want to win at the expense of what is right? Do we want to win at the expense of what is good? The common good has been said, for one another, for community, for citizenship, for society. Is there a sign of hope? Well, hope's difficult, isn't it? Because hope is expectation. Hope is what we trust in. Now, I'm a person of faith, so I believe our hope is in somebody we can trust. It's firm foundation. I'm also a Man United supporter. Now, I can hope every Saturday or Friday or whenever that they're actually going to win at home for once. Is it going to happen? I'm not so sure. But hope in the eternal is something very, very different. It comes in many shapes and forms. Often the great reformers never saw the fruit of what they hoped for. We look at a Wilberforce years and years ago, yet today we still fight for anti-slavery. We look at Martin King, we look at Nelson Mandela. We even in the UK, we had the great Quaker reformers. I'm not sure if it was a coincidence that they were all involved in chocolate, but they were, which I love. But they were the great reformers. They were the Fry family, the Elizabeth Frys. They were the Cadburys, the Terrys, who saw the poverty around them and the need, and didn't just say, okay, there's a problem. They made housing, whole villages where they could house workers. Or the Guinness family in Ireland, who said, okay, there is a problem with the water supply here. People are just drinking gin. We need to do something about this. So they created something. We'd say, no, people shouldn't just drink Guinness all day. But at the time, it was the thing that really, really helped. There was a practical application, a sign of hope, maybe, that still we fight for today. Still, we have the same situations. What is it you're longing for? What is it I am longing for? Hope is rooted in something deeper. What is it we hope for a leader to say? Does my nation give me that identity? Or is it a desire really for more than that, to raise community around us? We just need to look around. It doesn't always look or sound like we expect. It often comes from unexpected sources. It's never pretty. And it's not slick usually, but it is authentic and it's tested conviction. It's often understated and played out in simple acts, a change of policy perhaps, a discovery, or even just a smile, maybe an eye meeting an eye, a simple reach of a hand, or a humble concession on a policy, a disagreement perhaps, John and I might disagree, rooted in respect, a nature of dignity, and a justice done on behalf of somebody. I really could go on. In my church service on Sunday, our speaker, Joe, gave a quote that I would like to share, and it simply said this. It said, hope still wins, but it is often has a tear-stained face. It has a vulnerable heart, and it has bloody fists because it keeps fighting. It has scraped knees because it keeps crawling forward, and it's sweaty. Hope is not necessarily pretty, but you always want hope on your side because hope fights for you. Hope will fight for the hardest part of your life. Now is the perfect time, I think, to be reminded that there is hope, not a false, misplaced, I-centered hope, not a hope that bears false witness or makes idols out of an unjust motive. But as a person of faith, I would argue it starts and surely ends with the Alpha and the Omega, Emmanuel, God with us. An unceasing, uncreated, everlasting hope found in Jesus. So Tihomir, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in a rapidly changing world? I think it means to speak out when needed, to hold on to truth and justice, and to ultimately, it means to keep speaking and trusting, to act and give hope to all, maybe, trusting in the true giver and foundation of our hope.
Thank you, friends, for watching and listening. Stay tuned as we plan a new series of webinars and online activities on faith and current issues. Meanwhile, we wish you and your families a happy new year filled with love, compassion, hope, and courage.